Golden World Studios, Detroit, March 1971. 2:47 p.m. The Neumann U-47 microphone, vintage and temperamental, had been Marvin Gaye's preferred choice for vocals since he'd started recording at the studio 6 months earlier. Engineers treated it like religious artifact. Chrome body polished to mirror shine, capsule alignment checked before every session. It had captured some of the warmest vocal tones ever committed to tape. And on this particular Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of take 17 of Mercy, Mercy Me, it died. Not a gradual fade, not a warning crackle, just a clean cut to silence, as if someone had severed the connection between Marvin's voice and the entire recording apparatus. In the control room, engineer Steve Smith's face went pale. He killed the talkback and looked at producer David Van de Pitt, who was already reaching for the phone to call Barry Gordy. Behind the glass, Marvin stood, frozen in the vocal booth, headphones still on, watching the engineers through the window. In the main studio, the 19-piece orchestra hired for the session began to shift in their seats. Violins were lowered. The cellist checked his watch. Smith hit the talkback. "Marvin, we've got a technical issue. The U-47 just went dead." Marvin didn't move, just looked at the microphone like it had personally betrayed him. "How long to fix it?" Van de Pitt asked, already calculating lost time. Smith was pulling cables, checking connections, his hands moving with the urgency of a surgeon trying to restart a heart. Could be the tube, could be the transformer, could be the capsule. If it's the capsule, we're looking at days, maybe weeks. That mic is 40 years old. Parts don't exist anymore. In the studio, the orchestra leader, a session veteran named Marcus Belgrave, stood up. "Gentlemen, we're on union time here. If you need to reschedule—" "We can't reschedule," Van de Pitt said, not to Belgrave, but to the universe. "We've got the studio booked for 3 more hours. We've got 19 musicians billing by the hour. We've got Marvin in a zone, and you don't reschedule Marvin when he's in a zone." Smith pulled the U-47 from its mount, cradling it like wounded animal. "David, this thing is dead. I mean, completely dead. No signal, no voltage, nothing. It's a $3,000 paperweight right now. So we use another mic. We don't have another U-47, and Marvin won't sing on anything else. You know this. We spent 2 weeks testing microphones when we started these sessions. He rejected every single one except this." Van de Pitt closed his eyes. 3 months into recording what would become What's Going On, and every day felt like defusing a bomb. Barry Gordy hated the concept. Radio programmers thought it was too political. And Marvin, brilliant and fragile and impossibly particular, was walking a tightrope between genius and complete breakdown. The last thing they needed was a technical failure that would give him an excuse to abandon the whole project. Through the glass, Marvin removed his headphones and stepped out of the booth. The session had been difficult from the start. 17 takes of Mercy, Mercy Me, and Marvin still wasn't satisfied. Not with the performance exactly. The orchestra was flawless. The arrangement was gorgeous. But something in Marvin's vocal wasn't landing the way he heard it in his head. Each take got closer, but closer wasn't good enough. And now, with the microphone dead and the clock ticking and 19 musicians waiting, the entire session was about to collapse. Marvin walked past the orchestra, through the studio door, and into the control room. He didn't look angry, didn't look frustrated. He just looked like a man who'd been expecting disaster all along. "So," he said quietly, "that's it?" Van de Pitt started to answer, but Smith interrupted. "Marvin, I'm sorry. That U-47 has been acting up for weeks. I should have had a backup plan. This is on me." Marvin nodded slowly. Then he looked at the console, at all the blinking meters and sliding faders, and asked a question that changed everything. "What about the room mic?" Smith blinked. "The room mic? For the orchestra? You've got a mic out there picking up the ensemble, right?" "Yeah, but that's just for ambience. It's a stereo pair, Neumann KM84s, hung about 20 feet up. They're not for vocals, Marvin. They're for capturing the air in the room. Can you turn them up?" "Turn them up?" "Marvin, those mics are designed to pick up an entire orchestra from a distance. If you try to sing into them, you're going to sound thin, distant, like you're in a tunnel." Can you turn them up? Marvin repeated, and there was something in his voice that made Smith stop talking. Van de Pitt leaned forward. Marvin, even if we could technically do this, the quality won't be there. You'll be 20 feet from the capsule. You'll be competing with 19 instruments. The definition, the intimacy we've been building on every other track, it'll be gone. Marvin was already walking back toward the studio. Let me try. Try what? One take. If it doesn't work, we reschedule. But let me try. Smith and Van de Pitt exchanged a look. The look said, we've already lost the session. What's one more ruined take? Smith hit the talkback. Okay, Marvin, go stand center stage, right in the middle of the orchestra. I'm going to push the room mics up. You're not going to have any proximity, so you'll need to project, but not like you're shouting. This is going to be weird. Marvin positioned himself in the center of the studio, surrounded by musicians on all sides. The cellist to his left, violins to his right, horns behind him, no music stand, no lyric sheet, no booth to isolate his voice. Just Marvin and 19 people and 2 small microphones hanging from the ceiling like distant stars. In the control room, Smith routed the room mics to the vocal track and pushed the faders up. The meters jumped. He could hear everything now. The creaking of chairs, someone's breathing, the hum of the studio lights, and somewhere in all that ambient noise, Marvin's voice would have to find space. This is insane, Smith muttered. Roll tape, Van de Pitt said. Smith hit record. The orchestra began, strings first, that descending melodic line that opened, Mercy, Mercy Me, sad and beautiful and inevitable. Then the bass, walking a line between hope and resignation, the horns entering on the 4th bar, adding color and texture and weight. And then Marvin started to sing. But he wasn't singing the way he'd sung on the previous 17 takes. He wasn't trying to punch through the arrangement or dominate the mix. Instead, he was singing with the orchestra, not over it. His voice moving through the spaces between instruments, finding pockets of air where the strings pulled back, where the horns took a breath, where the rhythm section left room. In the control room, Smith's hands froze on the console. He'd been about to adjust levels, but something stopped him. The sound coming through the monitors was wrong in every technical sense. Marvin's voice was distant, yes. It had less definition than a close mic vocal, yes. But it also had something that none of the previous 17 takes had possessed. Intimacy. Not the forced intimacy of a singer pressed against a microphone, but the natural intimacy of someone singing in the same room with you, breathing the same air, existing in the same physical space. 20 feet of distance had somehow made Marvin sound closer. Van de Pitt leaned toward the glass, watching Marvin sing, and he realized what was happening. Without the booth, without the isolation, without the psychological barrier of a microphone 3 inches from his face, Marvin had stopped performing. He was just singing, the way he might sing to himself, the way he might sing in his car or in the shower or in any moment when he forgot that anyone was listening. The first verse finished. The chorus began. Mercy, mercy me slash. Things ain't what they used to be. Marcus Belgrave, the orchestra leader, lowered his trumpet. Not because his part was over. He had another 8 bars to play. He lowered it because he needed to listen. Other musicians began to notice. The violinist in the second chair stopped bowing mid-phrase, caught herself, continued playing, but with her eyes locked on Marvin. The bassist, a stoic professional who'd played 1,000 sessions without showing emotion, had a strange expression on his face, something between confusion and revelation. Because what Marvin was doing shouldn't have been possible. Singing at conversation volume while surrounded by 19 amplified instruments should have resulted in a vocal that disappeared into the arrangement. But somehow Marvin's voice wasn't competing with the orchestra. It was riding on top of it, using the natural reverb of the room, the acoustic properties of the space, the way sound moved through air and around bodies and off walls. He was making 20 feet of distant sound, like intention instead of accident. In the control room, Smith's hand hovered over the faders. Every instinct told him to adjust something. Boost the high end to add clarity, compress the signal to increase presence, add reverb to fill the gaps. But he didn't touch anything, because somehow the recording was already perfect. The bridge arrived. Marvin's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Oil wasted on the oceans and upon our seas, fish full of mercury. The orchestra played softer, not because anyone had told them to, because they couldn't help it. Because when someone sings that quietly, that vulnerably, the only human response is to give them space. And then came the final chorus, and Marvin did something that Smith would later describe as the most extraordinary vocal performance he'd ever witnessed. He began to sing even more quietly, pulling back instead of pushing forward, turning the climax into an exhale instead of a crescendo. It violated every rule of pop music. Choruses were supposed to explode. Finales were supposed to soar. But Marvin was singing like a man who'd run out of strength, like someone confessing something they couldn't carry anymore. The orchestra finished. The last note faded. Silence filled the studio. Marvin stood motionless, eyes closed, surrounded by 19 musicians who weren't moving either. 10 seconds passed. 20. No one seemed to know what to do. The take was over, but something else was still happening, some emotional aftershock that hadn't finished reverberating. Finally, Marcus Belgrave broke the silence. He began to clap. Slow, deliberate applause. One by one, the other musicians joined. Not enthusiastic applause. Not celebratory. Something quieter. Something that felt more like bearing witness. In the control room, Von de Pitt and Smith sat frozen, staring at the tape reels still spinning. "Play it back," Van de Pitt said. Smith rewound the tape and hit play. The orchestra came through the monitors first, exactly as it had sounded in the room. Then Marvin's voice entered, and both men leaned forward simultaneously. It was there. Everything. The ache, the resignation, the environmental consciousness that gave the song its meaning. But more than that, something ineffable. Something that sounded less like a recording and more like a memory. Like listening to someone sing in the next room. Like overhearing a moment you weren't supposed to witness. "That's the take," Van de Pitt said. Smith nodded slowly. "That's the take." They called Marvin into the control room. He stood between them, headphones on, listening to the playback. His expression didn't change. When the song ended, he removed the headphones and looked at Van de Pitt. "It works?" "Marvin, it more than works. It's the best vocal on the entire album. But it's not close mic'd. You can hear the room. You can hear the orchestra bleeding into—" "That's why it works," Smith interrupted. "That's exactly why it works." 3 months later, What's Going On was released to radio. Mercy, Mercy Me became a single. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Critics called it one of the most emotionally devastating environmental protest songs ever recorded. DJs praised the warmth of the production, but no one except the people in that studio knew the story behind the vocal. No one knew about the broken microphone. No one knew about the room mic. No one knew about Marvin standing in the middle of an orchestra, singing without a safety net. The album won Grammys, sold millions, changed the trajectory of soul music. And for the rest of his career, engineers tried to recreate that sound, that warmth, that distance-made intimate quality that defined Mercy, Mercy Me. They bought vintage Neumann KM84s. They experimented with room placement. They studied the original session notes. But they could never quite capture it, because the sound wasn't about the equipment, it wasn't about the technique. It was about a man who, when his primary tool failed, didn't panic or postpone. He adapted. He found a way. And in doing so, he discovered something that no amount of planning or technology could have produced. 5 years later, Smith was interviewed for a Recording Magazine article about the What's Going On sessions. The interviewer asked about the technical approach to capturing Marvin's vocals. Smith paused, considering how much to reveal. "There's a moment on every classic record," he finally said, "where everything goes wrong, and that wrong thing becomes the signature sound. For Mercy, Mercy Me, it was a microphone failure. But here's what people don't understand. Marvin didn't make that broken session work through technical skill. He made it work through trust. He trusted the room. He trusted the orchestra. He trusted that sometimes less proximity creates more presence. Most singers would have demanded we stop until we could give them the perfect setup. Marvin walked away from perfect and found something better. That's not engineering. That's not production. That's artistry at a level where tools stop mattering and only truth remains." The interviewer asked one more question. "If you could go back and record that vocal with a working U-47, would you?" Smith didn't hesitate. No, because then it would have been just another great recording. Instead, it's a moment that proves something every engineer needs to learn. The best recordings aren't about eliminating problems. They're about knowing which problems to keep. Today, the original master tape of Mercy Mercy Me sits in Motown's archive vault. If you listen closely on headphones, you can still hear the artifacts Smith was worried about. The distant placement, the orchestral bleed, the room ambience that gives Marvin's voice a ghostly, almost supernatural quality. But what thousands of engineers have tried and failed to understand is that those weren't flaws. Those were features. The distance was the point. The vulnerability was the goal. The brokenness was the breakthrough. And somewhere in that session, in those 3 minutes and 45 seconds, Marvin Gaye taught everyone listening that sometimes the greatest performances happen not when everything goes according to plan, but when the plan falls apart and forces you to find what was true all along.